to watch or listen to the first few minutes of this, and you could give 3 to 5 main keys to living longer, what would you start by saying with that?
Well, the slightly nuanced answer would be it's going to be highly dependent on where you're most deficient today across the different, call it levers that you can pull. If you were going to try to take a view that on average, where are most people failing to capture benefit, I would say first and foremost, it's around exercise. I think everybody knows exercise is good for them. The question is how much? And it turns out that there's really no upper limit to the benefits you accrue from exercise. So I would say the first piece of advice I would give is however much you're exercising, you can probably do more and you will extract more value. And yes, there are going to be people who I'm speaking to that are already probably exercising at the point where there's diminishing returns.
Too much.
Yeah.
And they're hurting themselves.
Yeah. But acknowledging that we're talking to kind of 90% of people watching this, you can be exercising more. To which the next question is, great, cardio or weights? The answer is yes. You got to do both. You know, the benefit of having incredibly high cardiorespiratory fitness and being incredibly strong is so significant that it dwarfs even the harm of type 2 diabetes, smoking, and kidney failure. In other words, the magnitude of benefit that being strong and having high cardiorespiratory fitness brings is greater than the harm in magnitude of those other things.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that's got to be number one on the list.
So it can't just be, oh, I'm a runner, I like cycling, and I like swimming, and that's all I'm going to do. You've got to incorporate some type of resistance strength training.
That's right.
Body weight training, even just something where you're building.
And to be honest with you, if we're going to be really technical, even body weight training is probably not enough.
Really?
If you think about kind of the aging muscle, it has a few characteristics that define it. And the most important characteristic of the aging muscle that we can see is the loss of what are called type 2 fibers. So if you think back to your life growing up playing sports, what was the thing that most defined your athletic ability? Was probably your explosiveness.
Yes.
And explosiveness is
Fast
really
twitch,
exactly
explosiveness,
those are what type 2 fibers are. Those are fast twitch muscle fibers that give you explosiveness and power, even more than strength. Those muscle fibers shrink as you age.
Really?
And it's the shrinking of those muscle fibers that is what defines the aging muscle. So we have to be able to resist against that as much as possible. Our goal should be to slow and delay that as much as possible, because as we lose those type 2 or fast twitch muscle fibers, that's when we start to get into trouble as we age. And unfortunately, you can't exercise those muscles without heavy weight.
Or at least super heavy weight, or just more weight than you're comfortable with.
More weight than you're comfortable with, and you're not going to do that
with body weight alone.
With body weight alone, it's going to be very difficult to. I mean, there are tricks around it, right? You can certainly make body weight very complicated. Look, if you're doing upside down presses, that's sufficient body weight. Certainly for some people, push-ups would be sufficient, but probably for someone like you, it's not. Right. So, and similarly, like if you're only in the gym and you're getting all of that strength training, but you're not paying attention to your aerobic efficiency and your peak aerobic output, you're also just leaving, money on the table.
So, okay, so we need to be thinking about both cardio and also strength training. I think Dr. Gabrielle Lyon talks about like the need for building muscle and having more protein.
Yes.
So that we can have bigger, stronger muscles. It doesn't mean you have to look bulky or something, but you want your muscles to be stronger so you can live longer.
Yeah, muscles serve two really important purposes. The first is a metabolic purpose. The second is a structural purpose. So the metabolic purpose is your muscles are the most important repository for glucose. Glucose regulation is such an important part of controlling disease risk. So when glucose is unregulated, it ultimately leads to a condition called type 2 diabetes. But even long before you get to having type 2 diabetes, if you have glucose dysregulation in the form of insulin resistance, you're still at increased risk of cancer, heart disease, and Alzheimer's disease. And it's significant. It's not like a minor increase in risk. It's a near doubling of risk. So the most important organ in the body to regulate glucose is probably muscle, right? I mean, the pancreas and the liver obviously play an important role, but the muscle is the storage unit for glucose.
And when we build more muscle or have more muscle, essentially we can process the sugars through that more efficiently.
We have more place to store it, and we can do it with less insulin. So insulin is an important hormone that drives glucose into the muscle. But if the muscle is resistant to that insulin, that's called insulin resistance, you need more and more insulin to push and force the glucose in. And while that initially works and it gets the glucose in, it eventually leads to a problem with very elevated levels of insulin, which if chronically elevated are synonymous with disease.
Right. And just creates more body fat too, right?
Well, yes, because then insulin, of course, when it's chronically elevated, is driving more fat accumulation and less fat breakdown. So chronic elevated insulin is not something we want, and the best way to avoid that is to have muscles that are both big enough and sensitive enough to bring glucose in.